Mafia is a franchise with only 3 games, but each of them are memorable for different reasons. Recently I decided to go through the entire trilogy and see how good these games really are. So this video is a compilation of all my reviews for Mafia, with each one being the definitive edition of that specific game. Let me know what your favorite Mafia game is in the comment section below, and thanks for watching.
I'm sorry, Father. Consider this an act of divine retribution.
That make us even.
Mafia Definitive Edition sees us return to an enhanced version of Lost Heaven, Illinois, and experience Tommy Angelo's journey from cab driver to top gangster in the Salieri crime family. This game remakes the original Mafia from the ground up, including an expanded story and new assets, but to Hangar 13, the devs behind the game, updated enough to make this remake worth buying? Let's discuss. Taking place in the 1930s, in the heart of the Great Depression, we meet Tommy Angelo, the main character who's a cab driver struggling to make ends meet. One day, as he's outside his cab, he's forced to drive 2 men away from what appears to be an ambush, as they hold him at gunpoint and make him drive to the desired destination. Unknown to Tommy, these weren't just any 2 men, these were members of the Salieri crime family, Paulie Lombardo and Sam Trapani. Once they're dropped off back at the bar, he declines the Don's invitation to work for the organization until a little bit later when some rival gangs smash up his car, prompting him to seek out revenge. This was only the start of his journey, as there's many twists and turns that happen after. Because the game is linear, you experience the plot through chapters which are nothing more than mission names. What makes this story intriguing is that it starts out slow and then gradually ramps up. Many of the early missions don't involve anything complex, they just laid the foundation for some of the tougher sections that were to come. The game did a great job at inserting the tutorials as you play along in the story, instead of having an entire dedicated section to just learning the controls. This kept everything moving at a solid pace, eliminating the stagnant opening that's present in so many story-driven games. As you go through Tommy's journey, you understand why he makes the decisions that he does, and you can relate to his feelings. There are certain situations where you can see that he's conflicted in his decision making because he's forced to do things he doesn't want to do because he believes they're morally wrong, but he's torn because he enjoys everything that comes with being in the Mafia. The outside world influences a lot of the events that occur, and you can see the relationship between Tommy and everyone in the organization change over time until it reaches its tipping point. There are many hard truths that the player has to accept while playing the story, and the devs did a good job at making it feel like your choices had consequences. There is a sense of realism that met my expectations for a remake of this level. Everything from the atmosphere, cars, clothes, and music all made me feel like I stepped in a time machine back to the 1930s. The bars and restaurants all look vintage and contain older furniture that you wouldn't see today, obviously because this takes place almost 100 years ago from current times. Tommy is a character that seems bland on the surface, but once you understand that he's just a family man that wanted to earn a living but got entangled in the wrong situation, you start to sympathize with him. But once you consider everything he's done, you understand why the plot goes in the direction that it does. The devs did a great job at making you feel like Tommy is a good guy, but reminding you that he's still a mobster, and at the end of the day, he's breaking the law. Overall, this story is one that relies heavily on its main cast, and if you don't pay attention to the people around Tommy and their motivations, you can miss out on important story beats. If you enjoy a classic Mafia story with emotion and a little bit of grit, then you'll definitely want to experience this. The gameplay for this remake is greatly improved over the original, and it's noticeable right from the opening cutscene. The graphics for this game are good and are about what you would expect for a remake of a 20-year-old game. The most jarring change in graphics had to be the character models themselves. In every cutscene, the facial structures and animations look clean and crisp, giving each person their own identity. Just take a look at Tommy. The difference between the OG and the remake is like night and day. Having this fresh coat of paint on the characters helped to make them more memorable than they would have been if they still resembled the old graphics. As you can expect, you play as Tommy and only him from mission to mission. The main issue with his gameplay is that Tommy's movement is really stiff and slow. Every time you decide to run, walk, or move, it just feels like you're moving through mud. When you're in a heated combat encounter, you may find yourself wanting to do one thing and then pressing the button to do so, but because Tommy moves slow, he performs the action late and you end up dying. Focusing more on the combat, it's about what you would expect for a Mafia game. There's tons of shooting, killing, and robbing both other mobsters and police. You have various weapons you can use like the shotgun, rifle, pistols, machine guns, and melee weapons like baseball bats and knives. Each of these prove useful depending on the situation, but as you play, you'll discover which weapon you gravitate towards the most. For me, it was the shotgun, as many times there are areas where you need to get in close, and having a shotgun on you will help you blow right by the enemies. Of course, shotguns don't help when you're trying to shoot enemies from far distances, but because you can run and then hide behind cover, there's almost never a time where you can't close the distance on anybody in the area. You might be wondering how you can hold all of these weapons. And similar to other games, this game has a weapon wheel that you can use to rotate and find the item you're looking for. Personally, I didn't use this too much, as I preferred pressing L1 quickly to switch between my pistol and shotgun, but it depends on the player as to how they select their weapon. Unlike other action games, you can't just run and gun your way through every combat encounter, because if you do that, you'll die fast. Each time you take a bullet, your health goes down for a little bit until you find cover and allow it to regenerate some. This regeneration isn't very fast, and it doesn't increase your health back up to where it originally was, but it does allow you to slow down and breathe while you figure out your next plan of attack. In other words, if you don't take cover, you're going to die a lot. There's someone in the Salieri crew that houses all the guns and items you need for combat, so when you need to stock up, you just go see this person. When inside that room, you have all the guns previously mentioned available, allowing you to craft a loadout that best suits your playstyle. It's good to constantly look at what weapons you have available, as sometimes I went into the missions with little to no ammo because I forgot to re-up before starting the next section. Just some advice. The most confusing thing about the gameplay is why the story missions and free roam are separate. When inside the main menu, you have the ability to choose story or free ride, with the latter giving you the ability to roam the city freely as you please. The only problem is that there's nothing to do in the city. When looking at the map, there's no icons that tell you that something is available to do, just a map with some small symbols representing the places that you've been to. It's like the devs decided to give you the option to run around and shoot people outside the story if you wanted to. Why couldn't you free roam in between the missions baffles me, as it hinders the replayability of the game, as once you finish the story for the first time, there's no incentive to go back. If they used the tried and true formula of icons representing people on the map, then all of this could have flowed so much better. The enemies themselves could have used a little bit better AI, as there's times where they don't respond to your movements or will completely walk past you in the middle of combat encounters. It's not terrible by any means, but they could act a bit more realistic to be in line with how real everything else in the game is. There was times I was playing and found myself wondering how they didn't hear me run or jump when I was directly behind them. Not a huge issue, but one that could have added to the overall immersion. The environment looks great as well, as when you're driving through the city streets, the buildings and roads all have updated textures and seem to pop even from far distances. In order to create a faithful remake for a Mafia game, you had to nail the buildings and open areas, and Hangar 13 did exactly that. No matter where you went, every place felt unique from the rest, making them seem like actual places and not just another building with a different name. There's plenty of NPCs littered all throughout the city, with each person wearing clothes that you would expect to see for that era. These people would make comments and say things at you depending on which part of the story you were in. It would have been nice to have an option to press a button to say something back, but that's just me. These other people all add something to each area and each mission, as the actions they perform align with whatever is going on at the time. For example, there's a mission where you find yourself on a yacht for a party, and the passengers on the boat aren't just standing around, but they're dancing, talking, and drinking, like you would find at an actual party. The way the other people act helped separate Tommy from everyone else, making it feel like you were different than the average commoner within the city. The HUD for the game was updated to look more like GTA, as the speedometer and mini-map while driving was changed to align with today's gameplay standards. A much needed addition was the inclusion of waypoints, as whenever you drove to the next area, the game would guide you where you needed to go and how to get there. This seems like a common practice nowadays, but games 20 years ago did not include fast travel and road guides, making the trek from place to place longer than it needed to be. Since we're on the topic of driving, it's worth mentioning that the driving in this game is terrible. It doesn't matter which car you choose to take, it's still pretty bad. The speed of the car depends on the type of car you choose to drive, just like any other game, but it's the handling which is the core issue. Anytime you try to turn a corner or go down a city street, the car veers over where you turned at, so if you're driving and you turn your car left, it will drift far to the right, making you crash into the objects or people nearby. Because the driving is so bad, you're forced to drive slower, which limits the gameplay. Due to the addition of a skip drive function, which you can enable in the menu, you have the ability to skip almost every driving section, reducing some frustration. But what you can't skip are the sections where you need to escape the police after committing a crime. These moments aren't bad at first, but as you progress further and face an onslaught of cops, the driving issue is pushed front and center. These sections were so annoying it got to the point where I didn't want to commit a crime because I didn't want to deal with the police, where in a game called Mafia, that's not possible. Inside each mission, there are collectibles that you can find like magazines and cigarette cards. They are pretty easy to find as they're indicated by a colored dot on the minimap that's separate from the red enemy dots. I like these collectibles a lot as the art on them was really nice to look at, so nice that every time I saw one of these on the map, I almost always tried to collect it. I wish more games did book covers and cards because it's a nice change up to the normal concept art we get in most games. Simply put, Mafia Definitive Edition is a solid remake of the original that did a good job at capturing the essence of 1930s Illinois. It's not flawless and has some issues that hold it back from being considered a top tier remake like Resident Evil 4 or Final Fantasy 7, but it's still worth playing. For those reasons, I'm going to give this game an 8. I think this game is definitely worth a playthrough if you're into third-person shooting games in the mob. If you have PlayStation Plus Extra, the game is free on there, or if you have another way of playing the game at a reasonable price, then I would recommend picking this up.
Hey, Giuseppe, I brought you a new customer.
He's straight up, right?
Yes, sir, all the way. This here's Vito, my oldest friend. This is Giuseppe, the best safecracker in Empire
Retired,
Bay.
please. How are you? The papers for you?
Yeah, they are. You got them finished already?
It was a pain in the ass, but sure, they're done.
Well, thanks. This really gonna work?
Nobody from the army would bother you again, trust me.
You see? What'd I tell you? Here's the money. Take your papers, Vito.
The story for Mafia 2 has you playing as Vito Scaletta, a Sicilian immigrant who has just returned home from the US Army. Alongside Vito at almost all times is his best friend Joe, who helps Vito get acclimated to normal life while introducing him to key figures in the mob. As the story continues, you will see the relationship be tested as they go through different things that push them to their absolute limits. In my opinion, what makes this story better than Mafia 1 is that Vito goes through so many different things. While trying to make it in the organization, he has to deal with so many life events that turn every situation from bad to worse. And on top of that, these issues happen at the most inopportune times. Because of this timing, Vito is forced to make difficult choices that end up having dire consequences for not only him, but the ones he loves as well. Seeing these events take place made me sympathize with Vito, as you could see yourself or other people going through what he has to go through. To put it simply, it's not unrealistic to think that what happens to him could also happen to you. The events that take place are not placed conveniently just to make Vito's life harder, but instead they're real life issues that almost every human can relate to. Instead of being centered around a war between two families, the spotlight on this story is always shined on Vito and Joe. No matter what issue is going on within a particular crime family, it's never about the family, it's about how the pair chooses to deal with the issue. Viewing the story from this perspective allows the player to judge other characters from afar and question why they make the decisions that they do. When Vito is offered different business opportunities, you can't help but question the motives of everyone that he interacts with. You already know that Vito is loyal to Joe, and because of that, you go into each situation wondering who you can truly trust. One theme that's present from beginning to end is that rules are rules. It doesn't matter who's your friend or what kind of relationship you've built, the rules of the Mafia always stand true. The rules themselves are bent and broken by various characters, and you see the effect that has on the story as a whole. As the decisions that people make are driven solely by the breaking of said rule, even though the relationship with that individual may be in good standing. Choosing who and what Vito remains loyal to is what makes his character so different than Tommy, as Vito is driven by his loyalty to Joe, while Tommy was more of a family man. In the end, Mafia 2 has a grounded and relatable story that sees two friends go through much hardship just for the sake of money. If you enjoyed Mafia 1's story, then I'm sure you'll enjoy this one as well. The gameplay for Mafia 2 is about the same as the first. Of course, if you played Mafia Definitive Edition, then you know that that game is a remake, so there's some subtle differences, but at its core, it's still about the same. Vito's movement isn't as slow as Tommy's, but it's still not that fast. When going behind cover and getting into cars, there's a bit of delay that can get annoying when you get into the later chapters. A nice addition is that Vito has unlimited sprint, so you can run as long as you want no matter the situation. Sadly, it's not as useful as you might think, since enemies can shoot you accurately from long range, making running useless since increasing the distance between yourself and the enemies doesn't do much. Just like before, each mission is divided up in the chapters, where you would have to play and complete various objectives before moving on to the next. Within each chapter there's a lot to do, as the missions themselves are lengthy and require you to do a lot, instead of finishing something quick and then moving on. The biggest difference between the last game and this title is when it comes to mission structure, as this game is open world. As you're playing through a certain chapter, you have to go from point A to point B in order to continue the mission. But let's say you wanted to grab some new clothes or get a drink before driving to the next destination. Well, that's not an issue, as you could go right to that location before proceeding with the mission objective, whereas in the last game the free roam and chapters were completely separate. I loved how the symbols on the minimap represented the places you could visit. Wherever you wanted to go, you could open the map and find the symbol. Coming off a game where the open world was completely barren, this was deeply appreciated. There isn't a whole lot to do, but there's enough to keep you somewhat interested when not going through the main story missions. You could go into different bars and restaurants to order drinks or eat food that would increase your health if it was low. They had various options like coffee and alcoholic drinks, all giving you a slight boost so you could enter each mission without having to worry about your HP. At restaurants in Joe's apartment, you could eat food that would provide the same type of effects to your health, with the difference that the items at Joe's apartment were free. So if you were lacking in funds, you always had somewhere to go to heal up. Now, to buy all this stuff, you had money that you would earn from performing story missions, robbing stores, or delivering cars that would be impounded. By far the fastest and easiest way to earn money was by delivering the cars. It didn't matter where you got the car from or the condition the car was in, all you had to do was find a car, drop it off at the impound, and you got paid. This made it easy to buy weapons and other items to let you get prepared before starting the next mission. Speaking of weapons, there's various weapons you can use during combat that help you execute your enemies in a handful of satisfying ways. Obviously, there's handguns like pistols and revolvers that can be found on almost every enemy and serve as the easiest weapon to use during encounters, but there's more guns that prove useful depending on your playstyle. The Tommy gun, rifle, and grease gun all help you pick off mobsters from long range, allowing you to keep your distance instead of getting in too close. The bad thing about these long-range weapons is that they aren't very accurate and the reticle shrinks only when you hit the enemy, with it expanding after each shot, making it hard to rip off a consecutive string of shots that hit the target. If you get your hands on the Tommy gun, my recommendation would be to keep that on you at all times, not only because it's automatic, but because it has a high damage output. No matter if you're shooting from close range or from far away, the Tommy gun can decimate many enemies all at once. The reload takes a bit too long, but if you keep an eye on your ammo, then you can foresee when you'll run out and make sure you're behind cover at all times. There are shotguns and throwables as well, with the shotguns not being as strong as I thought they would be. The throwables were grenades and molotovs, but they needed to be refined a bit. Their grenades will cause an explosion, but many times the area of effect was too small and the enemies by the grenade wouldn't be affected. The molotovs were a lot more useful, as by throwing them not only would they light the area on fire, if an enemy was even near the fire they would get burned as well. Unfortunately, this was the same for Vito as well. There's one mission in particular where you have to kill someone and that person does nothing but throw molotovs while you try to make your way up. So what's the best plan of action? Hide behind cover, right? Well, it's not that simple. Because the molotovs burn the objects which burn you, even if you're behind cover, you still take damage, even though you shouldn't. This made no sense and made the game harder than it needed to be, but luckily there wasn't many of these sections during the main missions. If you're the type of gamer like myself that likes to run and gun through combat encounters, you're not going to be able to in this game. You have plenty of life and it regenerates when taking damage, but the rate it decreases when you get shot makes you have to pay attention at all times. It doesn't matter if you're behind cover or wide open, when you get shot, you'll know it. The enemies have better aim than you may think, as there's many times where you're above or below them, but they'll still find a way to pick you apart. This brings me to the issue of AI, as the way that enemies respawn isn't consistent, as sometimes they would run up and shoot me, while other times they're supposed to be shooting, and they stand there and do nothing. To make things worse, their animations were just off. When they would be behind cover, they wouldn't consistently pop out and try to shoot you, but instead shoot and go back in the cover, making you wait at least 10 seconds before they try and shoot again. This forces you to keep your eyes on all the enemies, because if you focus on one that is hiding behind cover for so long, the other enemies slowly move closer and will eventually shoot you because you weren't paying attention. Thankfully, you can see each enemy as they're represented by red triangles on the mini-map, but at all times you have to keep your eyes not only on the enemy, but on the map, to ensure that while you're killing one enemy, others aren't closing the distance on you at the same time. This wouldn't be a big deal if your health didn't deteriorate so fast, but since you can die after a couple shots, you really gotta be aware of your surroundings. If you didn't realize by now, you play as Vito the entire game, but for many of the missions you have Joe right by your side. To my surprise, Joe is a great partner as he provides solid cover and actually kills enemies to help you get through those long shootouts. What's even better is that Joe will shoot the enemies that get close to you, so if you do forget to pay attention, then there's a slight chance that Joe will save you when you're least expecting it. Since this is the definitive edition, there's some issues that make it a terrible port. As I just mentioned with Joe, when with other people sometimes they would get stuck in places or they wouldn't follow you as the game intends to happen. There's one mission in particular where you have to warn someone that they're about to be killed, and if you drive over there, the house completely bugs out. This was just one instance, but there's other times where the game doesn't function as it should. It could be bugs or missions ending due to things that weren't your fault, but the lack of polish on this port is noticeable right from the start. The graphics themselves look pretty good since this is a remaster, but everything else is scuffed. The atmosphere for Mafia 2 is great, and when not in combat, the game is just comfy. When you're driving from place to place, there's only a couple of radio stations you can listen to, and the music that plays can easily put you to sleep. The stations stay the same no matter which place you live in, but what does change is the environment, as it looks old and withered when Vito first returns home from the military, but after some time goes by, it looks a lot more vivid and lively. The city looks so much better when it's not dark and covered in snow, so when the weather finally clears up, it's much appreciated. Unfortunately, the driving in Mafia 2 is just as bad as Mafia 1. Again, it doesn't matter which car you're driving, the steering is terrible. Every time you turn a corner or go down a street, the car veers off to the side, causing you to crash into people, vehicles, and other buildings. What makes this issue worse is that the police force is always around and will try to find you for almost anything. If you're speeding down the street, the cops will chase you. Commit a crime, the cops will chase you. But what's most surprising is that if you accidentally run into a car with a person on the inside of it, they will still chase you. Because the driving is so bad, expect to have a lot of run-ins with the cops. But it's not all bad, as if the cops do corner you, there's an option for you to pay a fine, which would make them go away and allow you to get back to business. A nice mechanic that's overlooked due to how annoying the cops are in general. When going through each mission, there's Playboy magazines that can be found in almost any place throughout the game. These magazines are pretty easy to find, but the spots they're placed in are so obvious you can miss them entirely. They included the actual pictures themselves, so I won't be showing what the magazines had inside, but you could imagine the type of images that were present in each magazine. No real incentive to collect these unless you're trying to get the plat or all achievements. Overall, Mafia 2 is a game that did so much well and improved upon what was originally established in the first. Because the port itself is so bad, it hampers the gameplay experience and causes the game to run worse than it should. For those reasons, I'm going to give this game a 7. If you want to play this game, then I recommend playing the original Mafia 2 on PC or somewhere else. In my opinion, do not buy the definitive edition of the game, as it has a lot of issues that can ruin the immersion completely. Judging Mafia 2 on its own, the game is solid, and if you were a fan of the first Mafia, then you're definitely going to enjoy this one. I played through the previous 2 Mafia games, but decided to finally get around to Mafia 3 so I could complete the trilogy. I heard a lot of different opinions on Mafia 3, like the game is too repetitive and the missions are too similar in structure. So I finally decided to make a review and see if all of this is true. And sadly, it is. The gameplay for Mafia 3 is where all the criticism stems from. Going into this, I sorta knew what to expect, as I played the previous Mafia games and I knew how those were structured. So I was expecting your typical gunfights, car chases, and melee battles, all which we got. But the one thing that was apparent right from the start was that Hangar 13 tried to make this game bigger and more ambitious than anything that came before it. Unfortunately, they kinda missed the mark a bit. So is this game really that repetitive? The answer is absolutely. The structure of the game is broken up in a clever way, but it's how you accomplish everything is where the problem lies. The entire map is broken up by districts, and within those, there's rackets that you need to take over so you can have full control over the district. To do this, you have to destroy trucks, kill henchmen, rob buildings, etc. But the issue is that you're doing this over and over and over. And I'm not even exaggerating. You have to do these little racket missions easily over 50 times. To make it worse, there's a large dollar amount that lowers by destroying the rackets and stealing the money within each building. At first I was like, okay, it's only 20k, we'll knock this out quick. But later on, some of those rackets reach over $100,000. So you can only imagine how long it takes just to finish one racket. When completing these, you drive all over the district to actually reach each racket mission. But what confused me was what happened when you went to kill the racket boss. After you lower the dollar amount to 0 for a certain racket, you have to kill the boss who runs the particular racket so then you can take it over. But what happened was you would go back to a building where you just were for one of the other racket missions to kill that said boss. And in order to kill the boss, you have to go through waves upon waves of enemies. So essentially it feels like you're doing the same thing back to back once you get to the final mission of that racket. Only after completing all the rackets in a district could you finally kill the person you first set out to kill that would actually progress the story. All of these objectives for completing the rackets was cool at first, but by the time you reach the final district, it's apparent that this is nothing more than padding. There is no reason for this game to have this many of those type of missions. You could have just had one for each racket and that would have been sufficient. It couldn't get any worse, right? Yeah, it actually does. Since I played the definitive edition, I found out fast that this game is buggy. I encountered so many bugs when playing this game, and it amazes me how all of this didn't get patched by now. As a matter of fact, I tried playing this game months ago, and less than an hour in, I got locked into a cutscene where the scene plays over and over and over non-stop. Even after skipping it, the loading screen would never load the game back up. I actually thought the game was broken and I dropped it for a long time, until I tried again and started a new game and was able to get past the cutscene. But it doesn't stop there. There's other bugs that you'll encounter in the definitive edition that you can't possibly miss. Another major one is that every time I finish those rackets that I mentioned before, once the game loads back up, I'm put in the first person and can't move. I think almost every time I finished a racket this happened. Initially, I thought the game broke again, but to get around this you can simply load the checkpoint and the game will load as it should. There's other things like people standing in place after being shot tons of times, cars sinking into the ground, and enemies not appearing on the minimap, but I was just surprised that for a definitive edition, how unpolished the game was. If you played the OG Mafia 3, let me know if that was in a better state than this, because the definitive edition needed some more work on it for sure. I would say one of the most frustrating aspects about this gameplay by far was the driving. In both Mafia 1 definitive edition and this game, the driving is not good. At least in this title, you have the ability to upgrade your vehicle's stats and make them perform better, but even still, it's not as smooth as it needed to be. But once you adapt to the driving and understand how to maneuver your car, there's one thing that almost caused me to rage multiple times. And this is the fact that whenever you crash into anything at all, you take damage. No, I don't mean your car. I mean you. So if you're driving at 100 miles per hour and accidentally run into a light pole, you may lose half your health and your car will get damaged in the process. This doesn't seem like a big deal at first because you could just say, just don't crash the car, bro. But when you're driving away from cops and enemies, this becomes a really big deal. You're constantly sliding and turning all over the place, so crashing is inevitable. And if you're already low on health, hitting something is just going to make it even lower. So let's say you crash and your car catches fire and is about to explode. Now you have to get out of the car with virtually no health, steal or call in another car, all while trying to survive. Putting it simply, this happened to me a lot, and I died so many times in these exact scenarios. It makes no sense why you, the player, would take damage when crashing when you're still inside the car. This isn't real life, so why are you getting hurt? I think this game would have benefited from just having the car get damaged, and only if you get shot from another car, then you would get hurt too. This whole gameplay decision just made no sense whatsoever. However, Mafia 3 is definitely not all bad. The actual gameplay itself is still really fun. Since you're going through all these repetitive missions, Hangar 13 had to nail the feel of the action, and they definitely did. Running around and shooting enemies is really fun, and once you unlock more weapons, you have so many options in regards to how you approach each combat encounter. We'll get to the story later, but since the main character is on a mission to kill everybody, the gameplay mirrors that perfectly. When running through rackets, lieutenants, and capos, it really feels like we're unstoppable and will destroy anything in our path. Of course, you can't just run into any encounter and just blindly shoot everyone and think you won't die. The henchmen are a bit smarter than you might expect, as they'll move out of cover and try to shoot you from all directions. If you don't use your sort of vision that allows you to see through walls, you'll die a lot, because you won't be able to see where each enemy is. Unless you play on easy, you'll need to take cover and pick and choose your moments to attack, because rushing in is not always the best choice. This brings me to one of the coolest mechanics in the game, your associates. These partners of yours help you on your journey, and it's up to you to assign rackets and districts to each of them. Upon doing so, they provide you with different benefits depending on the associate. For example, one of them is a woman named Cassandra, and she can provide you with a guy with a truck who will drive to you and allow you to change your loadout, refill your ammo, and access other upgrades or modifications. If you wanted more armor, more health packs, vehicle upgrades, Lincoln upgrades, it can all be done from this vehicle. So if you really enjoy what she provides, you may want to assign more of the rackets to her instead of the others. I liked how all the associates offer valuable services, which make the choice of assigning rackets and districts that much harder. Even with the overabundance of rackets, there's only so many of them to go around between the 3 associates. So if you want to keep everybody happy, you better choose wisely. Unfortunately, this game lacks creativity in some areas. After everything we discussed so far, with you completing the racket missions and then using your associates to help you along the way, you would think that killing the capos that will give you control of the district would be really memorable, right? Well, it is, but it isn't. When going through the mission to finally cross someone off your hit list, you will play through some events that have you doing the same things you always do: shoot, rob, kill, rinse and repeat. The devs try to spice things up by having these take place in different areas, but even still, it's repetitive. I will give them credit though. The way we kill each of these people are really gruesome, and it feels like all the stuff we did up to that point actually paid off. But just going through the missions themselves, you could tell that there wasn't much depth to them. To have the culminating mission for that district be semi-repetitive when everything to get there was already tedious was disappointing to say the least. When it comes to the gameplay, that's really it. You're running around killing everything in sight throughout the racket missions, killing lieutenants and capos, and then assigning districts. There's some variance in regards to the associates and their benefits, the weapons you choose, and the type of rackets, but other than that, it's a lot of the same. The story for Mafia 3 is on par with the other 2 games and does a great job of telling a plot with lots of conflict and loss. You play as Lincoln Clay, a Vietnam War vet who just returned home and seeks to slowly put his life back together after the war. Soon after, you meet his adopted family, which consists of his brother Ellis and his father Sammy. When they start running into financial trouble, Lincoln decides to help them by settling their money issues with the Don, Sal Marcano. Some events later is where the story really begins. At first, it seems like Lincoln is just some big guy who might be the strong, silent type that we've seen in countless games, but as you get further into the story, you'll see that he has a lot more depth. Even more, you understand why he makes certain decisions and goes down a certain path. I thought the supporting characters were just as good, as there's another war veteran and a priest that make up Lincoln's small circle of trusted allies. John Donovan, the war vet, provides Lincoln with all the intel he needs on Marcano's associates, making it easier to take down the rackets. On the other hand, Father James, the priest, has been by Lincoln's side for years, and tries to help him remember the good he's done and keep him on the straight and narrow. In between main story missions, the game will play cutscenes with Donovan and Father James, which do an excellent job at depicting the difference in how they think and view the world. You can tell how the events in Vietnam affected Donovan by how he lacks compassion and empathy for Marcano, his associates, and the US Senate. He constantly refers to the war and what he went through during it, justifying the actions that he takes in the future.
Show me what else you managed to dig up.
You got it. 2 of the city's finest scumbags.
Meanwhile, Father James adds context to the events going on during 1968 and gives insight into how he feels about the actions Lincoln takes as you progress throughout the story. All of these take place after the story in an interview, but the interview is spliced up and segmented throughout the plot. I thought it was sad to see Father James be so positive and happy at the start, but slowly lose hope in not only Lincoln, but humanity as things progress. Personally, I enjoyed his clips more than Donovan because it made it easy to convey what was going on during that time. It's like he thrust you right into New Bordeaux and all the conflict that was happening in that time period.
Once I was done with seminary, Bishop Jenkins sent me to St. Michelle's Home for Colored Boys. That orphanage was a pile of shit from the day I got there till the day I left.
Speaking of conflict, the best thing this game does is its portrayal of life down south during the late 1960s. Since New Bordeaux is based off Louisiana, and it's the 60s, and you're a large black man, you can only imagine how much racist encounters there was going to be. It's actually insane the amount of slurs and hate that is shown to Lincoln, not just by his enemies, but by normal citizens too. Anytime you enter a store or building, you're getting called something.
This shop's whites only, boy.
there were establishments where you couldn't enter just because you were black, with the shop owner threatening to throw you out if you continued forward. There's racial groups that you encounter, and all the people in high power make it known that they do not respect or accept people of color. You can only imagine how good it felt to kill these racist people and make them pay for their crimes. The racism in this game is accurately depicted and serves as a stark reminder of what our society was and how far we've come since then. Adding on to that, I liked how worldwide events were interwoven throughout the story too, like the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy are told during the plot, only adding more realism to New Bordeaux and placing you further into the 60s. It just made everything feel seamless and more connected. The story for Mafia 3 is really simple and predictable, but its immersion and internal conflict between characters is what makes it worth playing through. The setting and tone for Mafia 3 is done better than the previous two games and serves as the pillars which hold the story together. Outside of the main story missions, there's some side activities that you can do to occupy your time. The first that I decided to try were the races, but of course, the game decided to bug out on these two, so I never got to try them. However, what's cool is that you can customize your cars by going to garages located all across the map. Here you can modify a whole bunch of different aspects of your vehicle. From color to exhaust to wheels, you can truly craft a car that matches your version of Lincoln Clay. All of it costs money to buy, but most of it isn't expensive, and I found myself getting a lot of upgrades in just one repair. I thought the side missions were cool as they were based around one of your associates and you had to solve a problem of theirs that consisted of the mechanics that we discussed earlier. In addition to their own side missions, there were other missions that you could complete that were related to the type of business that associate ran. So for Cassandra, one of the missions consisted of drug smuggling, which will help her own sort of business thrive. Even though these differed between associates, I found myself not investing much time into these either. The side content in Mafia 3 is there, but after doing all the racket missions, I didn't want to spend too much time with these because I was starting to get burned out. At first you may not think this will happen, but burnout is definitely a major issue with how repetitive this game is. The last thing I wanted to mention was the DLC that released months after this game dropped. These show up in your mission list as story missions, and to my surprise, they were actually pretty good. They took place in different locations and had you interacting with some new and old characters from the main story. But most importantly, there was some creativity within these missions. Of course, there's the usual shooting and killing, but what you're doing in between is different than what's in the main story. The environments you visit are unique, and what you experience is unlike anything in the other missions. Honestly, the difference between these missions and the main story is night and day. The entire time I played, I was way more engaged and entertained with these than I was before. It wasn't like the episodes did something groundbreaking that has never been done in gaming. It was just the difference between them was so apparent that it almost fell off, which is sad because it shows how samey everything else was in the game. The length of this content justifies the money spent too, because these will take you some time to get through. There's plenty of combat and new mechanics that will keep you interested and have you wanting to finish them. But after finishing the DLC, I was wondering, why didn't the devs make the main story this much fun? Where was this level of creativity during the main missions? The fact that they changed things up during these episodes showed that they are more than capable of doing so, they just didn't. To me it made no sense, but it is what it is I guess. Regardless, if you're going to play this game for the first time, I would recommend getting the DLCs, because they are definitely worth playing through. Overall, Mafia 3 is a game that could have been so much better. The gameplay is fun, but extremely repetitive, while the story does a great job at immersing you in the 1960s. When you look at it as a whole, I don't think Mafia 3 is as bad as people make it out to be. Yes, it's obvious where the flaws are within the game's structure, but let's not act like the core gameplay for this still isn't fun. For those reasons, I'm going to give this game a 7. If it wasn't for the repetitiveness, I would have scored this a lot higher, but for the simple fact that the DLC was so much better than the main story and was a lot more diverse, it left me with a sour taste in my mouth in regards to how I felt once I was finished with the game. Hopefully in the next Mafia game, the devs take the best elements of all three games and combine them to make the best Mafia title in the series. What did you think of Mafia 3? Did you enjoy this more than Mafia 1 or 2? Let me know in the comment section below, and if you enjoyed this review, check out one of my other reviews right here.